Okay, the non-field announces the beginning. I don't think I have any announcements. Does anybody want to correct me? Are there any announcements? PAA abstracts are due
September 29th.
September 29th.
In Chicago.
Today we're delighted to have Ashton Verdery introduced by our own Dennis Keys.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm delighted to introduce Ashton Verdery, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology and Demography at Pennsylvania State University. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina just last year. And his research so far has focused on social networks, computational sociology, quantitative methodology, and social demography. And today he'll be telling us about some of his work on kinship transitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really very excited to be here. I think this is work in progress, sort of I view it as a kind of larger project. I don't have the final answers yet, which is why it's perfect to be at Berkeley, where you all can tell me what to do better and how to fix the problems with it. I've got a lot of other research too. If anyone wants to talk about network sampling methods and stuff like that, I'd be happy to at a different point. But this is more focused on, I guess, pure demography. So the key points of this thing, and so if anyone needs to leave now, they just read this slide and then kind of remember, is that family kinship networks are critical elements of social life. I think as a person who also does social network stuff, the networks literature tends to kind of ignore kinship networks in favor of friendship and other kinds of ties. I think that's a little bit of a mistake, and I'd like to see more kinship-related research brought back in. In particular, I'm particularly interested in the demographic transitions effects on kinship, and we know that demographic transition shapes societies across the board, population growth, aging, and all that. But there's also massive changes in kinship networks and experiences. To some extent, this is obviously like a tautological phenomenon where, by definition, if people are having fewer children, they're having fewer children, right? But I think that there's actually kind of complex ramifications that stem from this. And I'll try and talk a little bit more about kind of those maybe at the end of this. So the basic question that I'm trying to ask is, what are the best understandings we have about future demographic change kind of imply for the future of kinship networks in a kind of cross-national comparative way of thinking about it? I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but I guess I think of this as being an interesting topic because it's kind of focused on a model-based version of demography rather than kind of a variable-based version, which I think are the questions that really motivate the way that I look at things. People have talked about this generative causality notion, where you try and come up with a model that a simple system that explains observed phenomenon rather than kind of taking data sets and then testing hypotheses on it. It's more coming up with a model and then using the results of that model to test hypotheses. This is a different way of thinking about things than I think we often see. So some of the biggest questions for me regard diffusion of information, broad scale changes in kinship networks, these demographic metabolism phenomena with cohort succession and things like that. I'm also interested in sort of the macrostructural thing. Macrostructural properties of systems. I think oftentimes we get a lot of leverage statistically by thinking about repeated events at the individual level, but when you're interested in kind of broad kinship networks or how an entire social network is constructed, it's important to kind of remember that the observed reality is only one realization of that process, and having a model that kind of tries to account for those observed realities is just a different way of thinking about it than individual kind of causality. All right, so specifically...
Are you suggesting that individual networks are subject to chance, or that the entire global network is also subject to it?
I think the way we often think about it is these dyadic level processes. Does information transmit across a certain time? But I think you can think of how is the whole network structured? That's a completely different question where these individual dyads produce a complete network structure that is more or less conducive to diffusion across the network. That's subject to chance. What we actually see going on. We can't just take the observed reality because that's an n of 1, right? And so I think simulation methods are really important ways to get at the variability that we might see in the observed reality rather than the actual specific case. So this is my favorite graph of all time, and I didn't make it, so that's this. Everyone knows the demographic transition. It's demography department. So, but I love this graph because it shows kind of the variability between countries, between regions, kind of the slower declines in countries like Sweden and older places, the faster decline in mortality in kind of more current situations like Mexico. Shows kind of the problems with data quality going back in the developing world. And it's got all this. So demographic transition is a broad phenomenon. Most countries in the world seem to be moving in that direction. There's sort of an uncertain future about what's going to happen. Are we going to continue to see fertility decline, or is it going to rebound up to a replacement level? I know a lot of people here are working on questions related to that. But this is sort of the broad context of where I'm looking at this. Within the demographic transition, a lot of research is focused on population growth topics. A lot is focused on age distributions, household structures. There's been great work out of here about household structures and long-run kind of changes in testing hypotheses about nuclear family structure and things like that. People focus on economic growth and human capital, but I guess I wanted to kind of go back and think about just social capital as a topic and try and bring that more to the fore of kind of current demographic research and questions about the demographic transition and demographic future. So we all know about population growth. There's huge variability in kind of projected future scenarios where in some ways the world's going to keep growing. Most people think that we're going to level off, and then there's some scenarios where population growth declines over time, or population size declines in the future. But I guess I wanted to ask, what do these variants imply about social capital? We know about age distributions. We know about kind of dependency ratios within those age distributions, how many people are up here versus here, up here and here versus in the middle. But how do those kind of structures interact with like the kinship patterns within societies to kind of create burdens on taxpayer systems and, sorry, not taxpayer systems, but individual families, rather than just at a macro level. One of my favorite papers that I've read in the last several years, and kind of the project that I want to base this on, kind of to emulate, is Wolfgang Lutz's large project on the future of human capital in different societies in the world, different countries. And he uses sorry for the granularity on this, but he uses cohort component projection methods to kind of make claims about what the future of human capital in terms of levels of education would be, under the assumption that we have a pretty good model of how many people have received only primary education, how many people have received tertiary education, and we can sort of envision those people are going to age, and so what does the future of the global education levels look like? This is under some different scenarios. Here's like if we expand enrollment, we'll see like massive growth in the tertiary education, whereas if we keep just a constant enrollment rate, that's going to be less, but we're still seeing kind of a great expansion of people with secondary education. And sort of this, like how do we peer into the future and know more about what the future is going to look like, is how I'm kind of viewing this project. But whereas he was asking questions about human capital, I'm trying to ask questions about social capital and family and kinship networks. So there's a sort of long-standing demographic theory of kinship, and I think this is a hugely underappreciated and powerful model that belongs up there with other kind of important social network models like balance theory and scale-free preferential attachment kinds of models. The basic idea is incredibly simple. It's who lives in a specific place really depends on the births into that place, the deaths from that place, and migration in and out. And that people are connected through socially relevant ties like parenthood and things like that that are created by demographic events. So this is a graph that I tried to do to illustrate it to people who are non-demographers, but you start with a couple men and a couple women, and some of them get married in a next time period. Some of them marry people from other places, and those people move in, or they marry people from other places. Then the next time period, maybe one of them moves out. One of those people who married in moves in. They all have children. Sometimes the children die, but it's this kind of elaboration of demographic events that produces kinship and networks. And it's I think it's a powerful, very simple model-based view of how one of the most important social ties that we have is are created and how populations are structured through kind of kinship networks. And it's really unclear to me why this really wonderful model is being ignored within the social networks literature in favor of kind of just looking at kind of friendship networks and other types of choice-based ties rather than status or attribute-based ties. So why should we care about this? Like, is it really relevant to like focus on kinship, or is it just a kind of, now that we live in a post-industrial society, or is it all about other types of social connections? So I think across the world there's huge evidence that kin ties really matter. This is United States in 1985 are the circles, and 2004 are the squares, and then the black lines are kin-based ties, and the hollow circles and stuff are non-kin-based ties, and this is levels of education by that. And so if you look at the number of close confidants that people have in their social networks, like one of our fundamental questions that we say is a really important version of social network ties, you can see like kin ties really outweigh non-kin ties in both time periods up until you get to very high levels of education in the present. So this is where that crossover is, so college educated and above. Kin ties are really important in the United States. In a great Population Development Review article, they look at a completely different context, developing world. They look at young child survival and the presence or absence of family members. This is really great, like meta-analysis. If you ever need to I wish more articles were written like that, like this just wonderful review article where it summarizes 39 studies and kind of gives you some kind of broad points. And so here they classified like what kind of effect do mothers seem to have in those studies versus fathers and different kinds of siblings and things like that. And the greens are positive, the blues are negative. Overall, like the presence of those people versus not tends to be associated with positive child survival outcomes in developing countries. There's also a lot of reasons to care about this regarding wealthy and healthy kind of aging. Huge amounts of instrumental support and financial transfers occur within families, like billions and billions of dollars of financial transfers occur within families. Recent estimates point out that approximately 12% of the racial wealth gap is attributable to large gifts within families, like largely inheritance-based kind of things. Another project that I'm working on that is different than this regards organ transplantation, like the exchange of a totally different kind. And one of the real thorny issues within that is that between race groups there are huge differences in living donor organ transplantation. Like there aren't very big differences in likelihoods of receiving deceased donor transplantation, but whites are much more likely to receive living donor transplantation. And so we're with partner in crime, Jonathan Daw. We're trying to kind of get underneath like what is causing this finding. The hypothesis in the medical literature is that this is a matter of access, that whites have more people who are more healthy in their kinship networks than African Americans. So we did a survey. It's a kind of cool, innovative network survey where we sampled focal individuals who are at risk of needing a kidney, and then did a complete enumeration of their social networks, and then sampled people from their networks to match genetic compatibility and health and other kind of factors to see whether that person would be like able to give them a kidney if needed. And we found that there's actually like no difference in access rates. This access hypothesis is completely gone. And this is largely the main reason that there's no difference is African Americans have lower like dyad level histocompatibility, so they're less likely to match and be able to receive an organ from a random member of their family. But they have larger families, so that kind of outweighs the lower level of likelihood to receive it from, or likelihood to match with someone within their family. So I think these kinship questions are really important for all sorts of things. There's a New York Times article about researchers confronting an epidemic of loneliness recently that I think kind of speaks to the broad kind of interest in this from all sorts of the press. Like I saw this, it was like one of the most emailed articles 2 weeks ago, last week, somewhere in there.
Can I just ask about this finding? Is
Yes.
this on people's extant networks or on the networks that they list? In other words, do African Americans have more relatives somewhere, or do they have more relatives that they report in their close network?
So we have a few different surveys on this. Both are true. So we have a PSID study that we did that just got published finally, that they do have larger networks of available people. And then we did this, how often do you talk to them and all those things. We tried to enumerate everyone. Like, you told us about this aunt. Does she have any children that you haven't already listed? Like really probing, that's why we have a very small sample, probing kind of ego network questions. And then we asked, how often do you talk to that person? How often do you visit, see them, and stuff like that? So it's both. Okay, so a paper that inspired me to kind of start working on this was Murphy's paper, Michael Murphy, I think, from 2011. It's in Population Development Review. And he looks at bridge kinship over time. He uses, we've got great data on Britain. So he uses the SOCSIM microsimulation program, which is housed here, staffed by Carl, and really very well staffed. And he looks at the demographic transition in Britain, and he asks, how much has this changed kinship in this country over time? And so he finds a growth in the number of siblings, and then a decline, big declines in nieces and nephews, some changes in children, but really large shifts over time in numbers of different types of kin. And I thought this was a really fascinating paper, and people hadn't done enough kind of follow-up work on it. In particular, people had, this is just one country. Like, let's think about what does the rest of the world look like? We know that England's demographic transition is more like Sweden's, a slow type, but what does it look like with a very rapid demographic transition? So this microsimulation approach, I think, is the right way to go about this. The basic idea is you specify rates of demographic events. People behave according to those rates, and then you can sort of track the kinship patterns of those people over time. I know most of you probably already know about this, but I really like this paper by Chung, which is a PA paper. I think I like your paper a lot, where he looks at kind of life course experiences of being in certain types of kinship roles over time as people age. So obviously you're not a parent until a certain age, or you're only a sibling for a certain period, because at some point your sibling will die. You're only a child for a while until your parents die and things like that. Anyway, it's a very good paper. I encourage you to read it. And a little bit older of a paper, also from here. I think it's Eugene Hamill, or Eugene maybe. He did a more theoretical version of this. It's a Proceedings National Academy of Science paper where he looked at, well, what does it look like if I have a situation where you just keep rates constant? How many fathers, brothers, sons, and like cousins, nieces, and nephews, very different kind of rates look like over time. If I keep rates constant, and that's it. But then what if I double fertility? How does that kind of respond? And he finds this kind of, bloom again in various kinship types as fertility goes up. What if we have fertility? They decline, but then they return. Anyways, very interesting theoretical stuff that inspired me to work on this. I tried to take advantage of really cool data from Nangron, Thailand, which is one province in northeast Thailand. It's about the size of like an eastern U.S. county, so like similar to like Center County in Pennsylvania where I live. It's a couple hundred, just a couple square miles. There's 51 small villages in there, and they really experienced massive differences in their demographic transitions. I don't have the slide here, but if you look at the earliest data point, which is in 1984, you can see that like some of these villages still have very high mortality and very high fertility, and some of them have low mortality, low fertility, and some of them are in the transition. And if you correlate that process, that older kind of indicator of demographic transition, so I took at what stage the fertility decline was, and you correlate that with the number of siblings or cousins or various other kin that people have 15 years down the line in 2000, the latest data, you can see there's really obviously strong relationships. It's somewhat of that tautology, but I think this led me to try and test, well, what is it? Is it a delay in the mortality decline? Is it a more rapid fertility decline? And test out differences between those to try and kind of emulate what Hamill had done with his study, but with confirming it with some empirical data, which I thought was an interesting.
What is the x-axis here?
The x-axis, this is age. Sorry, no.
Is this like some measure of how far on the demographic transition?
Yeah, sorry. X-axis is, how far along in the demographic transition. Y-axis is number of siblings. Sorry. And then these are different age groups. So this is historical demographic transition, present day siblings. Another study that I've been working on is trying to do this in the PSID, where you have individuals, and actually because of the household-based sampling of the PSID being every couple of years, in recent times, every year for the early period, you can actually kind of track kin of people who are study participants. You don't see this missing half, so you don't see, like, if your mom wasn't originally in the PSID, you don't see any of her family, but you do see your dad's whole line. And so we tried to enumerate in 2010 what the kind of numbers of extended and close kin that people have in the US. This is a population-based understanding of how many kin people have. And we have some estimates for it. We have some estimates for race differences. The problem with this is it's just the present. It doesn't really have any way of telling us about the future. So going back to my original question, what does this tell us about the future? I think it doesn't tell us too much, but there's some ways we can use this to validate against other data. I'm just going to skip this, but I'm not going to skip it actually. There's a lot of ways that people have gone about trying to answer this question, and I don't want to give short shrift to it or pretend that I'm the first person to invent it. There's great work in kind of mathematical demography about modeling what numbers of kin people would have under constant demographic rates. So Kieferts and Caswell predict using 1952 rates that women would have on average 45-year-old women would have on average 1.37 daughters. And so there's ways to do that, but this is mathematical abstraction that relies on thinking that rates are going to stay constant forever. So this, back to that Wolfgang Lutz approach with the population human capital kind of models. The cohort component projection is probably the best known method of demographic projection, where the people that are 20 to 24, 30 years later are going to be 50 to 54, and we can kind of assume that education levels stay kind of constant. Once you've attained a certain level, you kind of stay at that rate after a certain age. And so they are making these projections of human capital this way. The problem and the reason I can't use this for what I want to do is it doesn't work for dyadic kind of relations like kinship. Chung's paper where he's looking at people being alive at the same time that you are. It's like a two-person process, and so you can't just model it as an individual, stable individual attribute. The other problem with it is it doesn't, there's no way we know anything about these group-specific rates, like how likely are people who have one mother to die, how likely are people with siblings to have children versus people without siblings. These kind of input parameters are really problematic, so we couldn't do a demographic cohort component projection. So now that I've summarized everything, I'll get to that. Again, my goal is to kind of ask what are the best understandings we have about historical demography and future population stuff. Tell us about the likelihood of kind of social capital distributions, kinship distributions in different countries of the world. So I'm going to use as much historical data as I can, a lot of assumptions, and then SOCSIM program to kind of project forward what this would look like. When I say historical data, I use just absolutely everything that I could get my hands on. So the World Population Prospects is a great place to start. They have great projections. These are recently updated with new methods for projecting fertility and mortality rates that are arguably, and a lot of people seem to think are much better than historical methods. For really old data, actually, I know Gapminder is not a very scientific source, but they do have a lot of old data that they've compiled from various estimates that people have made over time. So I use those for really old total fertility rates and things like that. There's some data from the World Marriage Project, which is also kind of associated with the World Population Prospects. I use ages of marriage and kind of cohort measures of total marriage. OECD Family Database. And then I didn't have enough data, so I went back to very old demographic yearbooks. including like the 1949, 1950 demographic yearbooks, and I coded a lot of it by hand. Like I would printed it out and was like, well, how many people are divorced at this age, and how many people are there at this age? Oh, no, that's the crude divorce rate, right? So it took a really, really painful process to get all this data compiled. But I have it all compiled, and then I'm going to make some assumptions about ways to model it into the future, and then run the SOCSO program. So again, using historical and projected data, fitting functions to the points to fill in missing data, running simulation, calculating these kinship statistics of interest.
Could you say what is dynamic compositional scaling?
Next slide. So dynamic compositional scaling is what I'm calling the method that I came up with to solve a real big problem for this. So, and the problem relates to the fertility rates. The normal presentation of fertility rates is you have kind of an age-specific fertility rate, and the sum of all the age-specific rates is the total fertility rate, right? Or if it's 5-year groups, you multiply by 5 in there. What I want, because a lot of the questions that I'm asking about are kind of statuses that are defined by like not having anyone alive, not having any kin alive. So you need a difference between people who have spouses, people who don't, like a marital fertility rate and a non-marital fertility rate. You need a parity-specific fertility rate is really important to get accurate distributions of siblings. Because in some countries, like people only have one child, or people are much more likely to have one child than two, versus another country, people are much more likely to have 2 children than 1, and both of those could end up with a 1.5 TFR rate. And there's a very big difference in terms of the sibling distribution. 90% of people have, it's a terrible explanation of this. There's a very big difference between countries where, let's say the total fertility rate in 2 countries is 2. Like if one of them, people are more likely to have 1 and 2, and the other one, they're more likely to have 2 and 3 in such a way that the average is the same, you're going to get different numbers of siblings. I always like mess up how to say this, but the parity matters for numbers of siblings for obvious reasons. The problem, so we can imagine writing the total fertility rate just as a like decomposed, well, what's the total fertility rate among people of a given age, of a given parity, of a given marital status, and then you get a TFR just from that. The problem with that is it's just a descriptive measure, and it's not a prescriptive measure that people could actually, if you specify that as the rate, you're missing out on a big portion of the story that is going to kind of bias results. So I want a decomposed rate, and I want a decomposed rate, and I need to have it be something that people could behave according to lead to them having certain numbers of children when they're at a different age, parity, and marital status. So what I try and do here is first come up with what that decomposed rate should look like. What's the descriptive statistic first? So I use the human fertility collection, which is a great source of data, and I try and do age by parity decomposition from that. So in the human fertility collection, they give the age-specific fertility rates by birth order, which is like really very useful data and really interesting, kind of the way it plays out. So I try and say, like, all right, well, what proportion of TFR does that account for as a function of like a regression of age by parity interactions? And the next slide will make that a little clearer, I think. So what I first do is I define characteristic curves for each country, and then I just define like a kind of global average for the countries that are not in there. Like there's 100 countries in there, so it's quite a bit. And I'm going to make some assumptions that are maybe problematic, but I think are okay. So here's what I do. Here's the United States. Here's people who've had no prior children. Over there, people who've had 2 prior children. And there's a bunch of different ways that this data is measured. And there are 100 years, so 1917 to 2014 data for the US. So if you take all of those, I just fit the middle for the United States, right? The median at each age parity group. Not the median, the mean, because it's a regression. And so I'm going to say that that's like the characteristic age parity curve for the US. Other countries like China are a little bit different, where there's obviously thinner data, but you can see that China much more likely to have, across the observed periods, to hit that first birth. So there's more people in the US that are childless. And in China, there's like almost everyone has a first birth, but people don't have as many third births, whereas in the US, third births are like kind of characteristic of the US fertility process.
Okay, quick question on that.
Yeah.
So is it for the US across the three, it sums to 1?
Yeah.
Or is it within each it sums to 1?
Across the three. It's
Okay.
So the total, and so it's just like what percentage of the total fertility rate owes to 15-year-olds who've never had a kid versus 15-year-olds who've had 2 kids, which there are none of those, right? So that's obviously going to be 0.
Yeah, but okay.
You got the idea? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, why, so fertility is very different in 1917 than it is in 2014 in the US. Why do you think this is a characteristic of the US and not a characteristic of countries with a TFR of 5 or countries with a TFR of 2?
So I tried a lot of different ways to do this. Like originally I was using this older model that says here's the TFR and then here's the age curve, right? It doesn't have the parity, is the problem with that. But I tried to do it with like, all right, well, what if I group TFRs like 5, 3, 4, 2, like less than 2, and do that. And I found that that doesn't really add much information to the model in general. Like, if it just didn't seem to matter. I mean, I thought about adding it back in, but like just with just the age by order interactions, like it's like 73% of the variance of of this regression. 73% of that variance is age by order. Adding countries gets you to, and full country interactions gets you to like 79%, and then adding level of fertility gets you to like 79.1. Like it just doesn't, there's not much extra explanation, because where I kind of landed on it. I don't know, what do you think it's, I'd love to talk more about this.
Sure.
Because this is like the biggest trouble that I've been having. Yeah?
Sorry, can you explain the graph again? Because they're not confidence bounds, right? It looks like it's sort of a cumulative distribution, but it's...
Right, so these are all the observed, these are scatter plots of all the observed data in the human fertility collection for China. So this is all the observed proportions of TFR owing to each age group and parity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so, and then the lines of just, those are the values that I ended up using for that country.
I guess my inclination would be that I would think that the level of fertility would tell you a lot about these parity-specific rates. I would think the identity of the country over the course of a century would tell you relatively.
Yeah, and that's what I thought too. And I've been really struggling with this. Like, is this like, should I write a separate paper about this? I've been really struggling with this. So I would like to talk more about it in terms of like how you would test that competing hypotheses about that. So I come up with a curve for every country. Here's the US, there's China, and these are each country in the data, so 100 countries. And then I take the average of those for countries that I don't have data for. Couldn't think of anything better to do. Then I start trying to think, all right, well, how about adding the level, the marital status decomposition to it. So I take all the data that I have from those demographic yearbooks on the proportion of births to married. It used to be the legitimacy ratios and stuff like that. And you can see most countries actually, this is declining. I don't think that's a big surprise. But here's the sort of observed data that I have. And I said, like, what's the best thing that I can do that isn't totally insane? Like, let's fit a curve to it and sort of model it. So these down here are Caribbean countries. They tend to have throughout the whole data set had very low legitimacy rates. East Asian and some of the more religious Catholic countries are up there, and they've had rates that are much higher over time. And so this curve these are the curves that I'm going to use for those. And so kind of with the combination of this and the parity stuff, I think I have a descriptive age parity proportion of TFR for each country at each year that I want to use. There's some assumptions in there that are pretty tough, and I can say, okay, if I distribute the TFR over that proportionate, then that could be like a rate. The problem with that is that it doesn't have any of the denominators in it, And so I was running into this problem for a long time where some points I would have nobody that had parity 1, and like all of that TFR was just lost. I talked to Carl about this a number of times. He finally convinced me that I was right, that he was right, and I was wrong. I was thinking, like, why is this not working? And my population would always crash, and everyone would die, and my simulations would not be working. And it was a real problem. And it's because these denominators are not known. So to try and solve it, I came up with what I'm going to call dynamic compositional scaling. The basic idea is I have a population that has an age, period, sex, status structure. And I know that I want the rates to come out so that it sums to the TFR, and each age, parity, and sex have their own kind of levels. So what I do is I multiply, and it would come out to this if the population sizes of all the groups are equal, right? If there are equal groups in each one, then you can just ignore the denominators and it does come out correct, right? But they're not equal. So I come up with this way to adjust the rates up if there aren't enough married people. I adjust the single rates up. I adjust the marital rates up if there aren't enough married people. If there are too many singles, I adjust the single rates down through kind of the inverse proportion of the population times this desired decomposition. So the next graphs are just showing kind of the level of missing data that I kind of filled in. We have very good TFR data historically. This is the US. China you can't see. I should have made this like bright yellow or something. But going back, there's some, it gets thinner before 1950, before the World Population Prospects data kicks in. But we have a pretty good model. And then I just made assumptions about countries being at the level that they were in 1950, because a lot of the ones that we don't have data for are developing countries. So I filled in sort of that block up there of these high fertility rates, just kind of extending these backwards. Life expectancy at birth. We actually have quite a bit of historical data too, but for some of them we only have the country level, not the gender level, so I had to make some assumptions about that. And I filled in life expectancy at birth for genders. Some of these big plummets here, those are like famines and wars and stuff like that. Like I've looked at, like this is, I think this is the civil wars in the Balkans. Was I think that one for, I can't remember what country. But anyway, I filled in some data.
Ashton, what's the red line?
So the purpose, I'm always trying to highlight China and the US, because those are my examples from earlier. I should have said that. The dark one is the US, and the dashed one is China. And you can't see them very well. It's always like, it looks so good on your computer screen, and then you get to a projector.
But it's got a dip in 1918?
Yeah, I think that's the flu. I'm not sure, that's probably World War II, or World War I. This is late 1800s. Civil War, World War I. This is the marriage stuff. Marriage is really hard to specify in the SOCSIM program. So I'll talk more about how I do it, but I basically try and take the average age of marriage and then the kind of cohort completed ever married status and use those. So here's the actual data that I was able to get from all those various sources. And if you take every country and you fit curves to it, it kind of looks like this, that the average age of marriage tends to be going up in most places. But there was some decline throughout the 1800s.
I have a question. Are you using those predictive values after 2015
Yes.
in your model?
Yeah.
And so those don't really look realistic necessarily, even though,
The average age of marriage?
well,
I mean,
it just keeps going up.
Some places are.
I think that is, like I've looked at,
So people.
so what were you saying?
I mean, if people are not getting married, they're just going.
Yeah, the average age of marriage is going up quite a bit. Like the
Do you
US
think there'd be an
projection.
asymptote at some point?
I mean, it sort of seems to be.
I mean, they do that with fertility projections.
That might make sense, but the one that I've done the most in-depth stuff is the US. And the projection for the US is, I can't remember the paper, but the projection is white rates and black rates. They're going into the 40s by 2060 is this estimate from this paper. I mean, we're out in the future. I don't know what the goal is. And the scaling method kind of deals with some of those problems. Percent ever married. A lot of countries we see sort of a collapse and a rise. So here's what I did for the percent ever married. I also have the projection into the future, so it is kind of a curve that continues. I must have put the wrong graph on there. So I specify the marriage rates by saying 60% of people get married up until the mean age of marriage. And so that would give you like the monthly marriage rate from age 15 to that mean age of marriage. And then from the mean age of marriage to 50, the remainder up until the percent ever married by 50 gets married. I know that this is a cohort measure, percent ever married by 50, and I'm trying to use it as a period measure, and I think that's a problem. But I couldn't think of anything better to do, so if you have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Divorce rates are pretty tough to specify too. You need kind of a way to specify divorce, and in SOCSIM, they specify it according to the age of the marriage, not the age of the person. So what I did was I tried to say, we have some life table estimates of divorce stuff that Phil Cohen made pretty recently. And so I looked at that, what are kind of the age of marriage rate of divorce, and said, okay, well here's what the US looks like. Maybe I can just use that and just scale it somehow. And the US, and then I compared it to all the other OECD countries, the proportion of divorces by duration of the marriage. And the US is actually pretty much in the middle of that, so I'm hoping that that makes this assumption reasonable. And then I'm going to scale the divorce rates up and down according to the crude divorce rates, so that different countries maybe have higher, each age of marriage will have a higher level of divorce or lower level, and that varies over time. I mean, the crude divorce rate is the only thing that you can find that's pretty consistent in historical demographic data. Like, I couldn't find by age of marriage divorce rates for historical stuff. All right, so then I ran SOCSIM, and it's got the opening with two ends, which always makes me pretty happy. And it simulates. It works pretty well. Sometimes you have to email Carl and bug him. So, and this is where I'm kind of where I am basically. And I kind of lack some of the broad takeaways. But I think it's reproducing things in a way that is pretty encouraging. So this is China in 2016, in 2000, and then 2050, the projection from the Census Bureau. And the age structures look very similar, right? These are the simulated ones. That's historical, and then that's the census's projection of China. And I think the age structures look very similar. I've tried to think of another way to do this, like maybe calculating the root mean square error or something to have an actual quantitative measure. But for now, I feel like it's reproducing some age stuff in a nice way.
Can you just spend a little more time and tell us what the blue and the red mean?
Yeah, so here is the number of projected spouses for each age group. So obviously people that are children don't have spouses. And most of these people in the kind of middle ages do have a spouse who's alive. And so it's a standard population pyramid, but this is, the blue is number of spouses, the red is people without spouses, so how many people have spouses versus not. We can see a big kind of shift in that, which is to be expected with marriage squeezes in China. And you can even see like some gender composition differences by male and female and stuff like that I think are pretty interesting. I was able to get, I then went through all the simulated data and then calculated what the total fertility rate was in the simulated data versus the parameter that I put in for that data. And for China, it works pretty well. I've got the different kind of UN projection variants, the high and low variant for China. But you can see this is when I ran it on the median variant. It is pretty much hitting that projected fertility rate. For population size estimates, this is the projection from the census and the current estimates historically, and then that's the simulated population size. So it is having similar behaviors to what's going on. And I find this in country after country, but I won't bore you with all the validation stuff. Here's the USA age of marriage stuff, and so this is that historical data, the mean age of marriage, and then this is what it's supposed to be doing. But but I can't get it to do that. Like, I just can't make it rise that much. And I don't know why that's the case, but maybe that's a good thing, because maybe it shouldn't be rising as much as some people think, or as the naive projection would make it seem like it would. Life expectancy at birth, I take the simulated data and calculate the life expectancy at birth from that, and that's really nailing it. It's really hitting it very well, which I think is encouraging. You'd expect that. From a network's perspective, if you take the data and start looking at the actual ties, they do look like kinship networks. I've not been able to find anything that would be like this. There's some randomness going on that I'm missing out on stuff. So this is what kinship networks should look like: little clusters of people that are tied into larger groups of people through marriage, and then you have your little family with your children. They're all tied to each other through siblinghood and stuff like that.
This is your simulation. This is an actual two network from Liberia.
Oh, but this is my simulated data. Yeah, but this is what real data should look like. Yeah.
Why did you pick Liberia?
I have an example towards the end that I'll talk about. I'm interested in trying to understand potential kinship network influences and demographic transition influences on the Ebola outbreak of 2014.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I'll come back to that. All right, so here's siblings and cousins. And this is not the scaled data, so this is basically, it's not right, but the kind of where I'm going. My grad student is making this website where you can kind of scale through this over time and look at it, so you can sort of make projections over time and play like videos and stuff that I'm going to hope to use in some teaching and stuff like that. You can look at, compare different countries, so numbers of siblings in India and China. They have kind of a similar structure in 1970, but projected pretty different kind of population structure because of the transition in China. And so there's going to be people in India who have many more siblings in 2020, or people in India do today have many more siblings. And in 2060, they're still going to have many more siblings than China because of obvious reasons, right? You can look at parents who have living children. Sorry, I should have explained this. The red are people with none, blue are people with 0 or with 4+, and the lines in between are 3 children, 2 children, 1 children. And so you can see that in China, these older parents are going to have many more likely to have no siblings, versus in India, that's going to be a pretty rare phenomenon for older age people in 2050. There's questions you could ask about people that have both, that are in the sandwich generation, having both older adults and very young children. One of the things that I think this could be very interesting for is kind of rethinking the standard dependency ratios and thinking of it as a kinship dependency ratio. The standard dependency ratio is you take numbers of people over 65. Opposite, I did that wrong. No, this should be a 6 right there, 65. So number of people over 65, number of people under 15, and divide it by the number of people between those ages. If you look at these rates over time, just taking the projections of population structure, you can see that like different countries of the world are generally declining in their rates and then going up as the burden of aging becomes a real problem. But I was thinking, well, what happens if we make a kinship dependency ratio, where we take the average number, like at the individual level, how many people have, like the mean number of parents and children for each individual. And it's kind of totally different kind of pattern, where all the countries seem to be kind of converging in this sequential order of like the wealthiest countries hit this rate, and then the upper middle countries, the lower middle, the lowest countries all hit this rate of kinship dependency at the individual level over time, which I think maybe is more theoretically kind of conforms with some of our demography. Yes?
But I don't think what you've written up there is quite right for what you're doing with the kinship debt, which is not important. What I'm not understanding is for the usual ratio is working age adults, whether it's 15 to 50 or 15 to 65.
65.
And then the number of people dependent on them. So are you imagining now that you're just taking the people ages 15 to 65 and now they get in their dependency ratio they're required to support the children under 15 of all their nieces and nephews and grandkids? And are they also expected then to support all of the people over age 65 that are in any way related to them? Is that the ratio you're calculating out?
No, I think it's the opposite. The normal ratio is just take the number of people over 65 and under 15 and divide that by the work groups, right? It's not, like you make it on the census data, right? It's just the age groups.
I know, yeah.
That's the normal one. What I'm doing is saying, all right, what if we do it on the individuals? So who, the number of people who, at the individual level, you have 2 old parents and 2 young children, you'd get a value of 4 over 1. And someone else has no old parents, so they'd be 0. And then take the average of all of that at the individual level, based on these actual kin ties, and particularly children and parents. So it's like,
So it's your specific parents and your specific.
your specific parents and your specific children, which I think is theoretically closer to what we want, versus the other one where you have all the people over 65, all the people under 15, is more like each individual supporting everyone else's kids and parents, right?
So old people with no children don't actually figure in.
Yeah.
Part of this.
Yeah.
But the social policy,
Right, so, but it's a different question. The social policy question has been explored and is a really interesting one, but I think for like individual transfers within households, this one might be more relevant. So like, I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss this one. Like, I think obviously this has got a long history and is really important.
But it's,
So it's 1 o'clock, we're entering discussion, which
Okay.
is fine, but if we're gonna enter discussion, then we're not gonna go back to.
Oh,
maybe
sorry, so I went
If you could
Yeah.
maybe
Wrap
wrap up and we can then
Yeah, I've got
continue this.
my last, I'll end here. I tried to validate this with some empirical data. I took the International Social Survey programs, and basically I am getting pretty close results at the country level to what is observed. But that's really all I've got a bunch of future directions, but that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Let's actually just pick up off that previous discussion, I didn't realize.
No, sorry, I didn't.
Give me a chance to say, can you go back to the slide that you were asking about?
so is the discrepancy between them that there's a bunch of old people without any relations that are dropping out?
Yes, yeah, that's where it comes out.
Which is a social insight, yeah.
Which is it's a very big question. I mean, I don't know what to do with this. I just,
and
maybe decomposing what the cause of the difference is.
yeah, I mean, I think understanding actually getting a count of elders with no kin.
So this,
And now you're not going to get children with no kin. I mean, in the olden days you might, but now you don't, right?
yeah,
The
developing
maternal mortality
countries.
is being brought down really, really low.
Yeah, so this is another project that I'm working on that with the same application that is trying to quantify older adults without kin. In the US, it's kind of a paired project where we're taking health retirement study and all the estimates we can get from that, and then doing projections forward. And by race groups. And so we are trying to quantify like how large is that population. And you can see some tripling.
And by kin, I shouldn't use the word kin, it's actually children. The elders without children are what drive, the larger number of elders without children is what's driving the difference between the two measures.
Right, that's in the kinship dependency ratio, yes. In this, we define it a whole bunch of different ways. We have 5 different definitions. One is without a spouse, one is without a spouse and children, spouse, children. So we have a bunch of different ways of it. This is just one of the graphs that we have.
You might want to watch out with that word kinship dependency ratio because it made me think of aunts and uncles and cousins and siblings. It sounds like you're not doing that at all. You're still focused on the
Maybe like the
child, and it's an individual level rather than a group kind of.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to phrase it then, to make it. Yeah, I agree. That makes sense.
So how do you do, especially in the slide where you have the age at marriage, for instance, marriage specific measures, do you actually actually look at marriage, or do you look at any kind of union? For the US, it's not going to make a lot of difference, but for Europe, it's going to make a huge difference.
So I'm looking at marriage specifically, although people in the SOCSIM program can cohabit. I mean, it's sort of like, it's not really like it's a computer program, it's not actually cohabiting.
No, but you have to input some data to start your simulation. So in the input data, do you have only married couples, or do you have union?
So I use really old data from the mid 1800s. So they are only married at that time because rates were pretty high. Yes, go ahead.
Just a very general question, because you're doing probably the most ambitious project that's ever been done with SOCSIM, right? Because you're doing all countries, all time type of thing. And you have this tension between doing something that's about right, that's easy, and then adding information and modeling. And so you actually, I'm surprised how much information you're trying to incorporate. Maybe just some comments on how you thought about that, and now if you had to do over, would you, and what the tensions are, because in some sense the SOCSIM model of marriage and order-specific fertility is probably wrong anyway, so it doesn't even help to get the rates exactly right, stylized assumptions there. Issues like Margolis talking about are big issues and things like that. But there's a certain believability if you were just to use some model demographic transition, the same model demographic transition for all countries, then maybe we wouldn't be learning as much.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that. I mean, so part of it is, let's see, this kind of validation stuff. I mean, when I did the validation, like, yes, it hits the number of children, like, almost perfectly, hits the number of parents really well. The siblings rate, so these are 27 countries in Europe, and I took the age-specific, age-sex-specific counts of everything, and then regressed my simulated data, like the prediction that I had for that country against the actual survey data for that country and that age-sex, so I could get it from more in. And like, this is before I did the scaling, so this is like where this project is still in progress, because I need to go back and remake this. I was going to try and do it yesterday, but I didn't get around to it. And the siblings were off, right, like by a lot. So I felt like I really needed the order-specific stuff in there, because clearly the siblings distribution is way off, and I think for a lot of questions that's an interesting reason. And so I basically just kept adding more data and adding more data until I feel like now I'm not sure. Like, should I go back and just tear it all down and just do the model? I'm not sure about that at this point.
So you just to summarize, so something this is telling us that maybe your order-specific dynamic rescaling is not working quite right.
No, this is before I did the order-specific scaling.
Okay.
These are the results when I was just ignoring order.
Okay.
And so it was not working quite right.
And now you can check to see with your new ones whether it does work. Okay.
And if I had been more diligent yesterday, I would have made the same graph for the order-specific stuff.
It seems like one important advantage, as opposed to most of the other work I know with SOCSIM, is that there's not much validation for most of these quantities because surveys have not been available. But now you're working at a time where you're able to take advantage of a lot more of these surveys. So you could almost do it backwards, where you have some model, you don't even know what the parameters should be, and you just throw in parameters until you match the observed.
That's Amelia Zagini's stuff is very similar to that. I mean, I think that is probably the way to go, but I just I'm not smart enough to have understood it quite yet. But I think that is a really good way to go of trying to hit targets. This data, one of the future projects that I want to do too is to take that same data and try and explain like all these studies of declining social networks in America and all these things like that. Like, I kind of are ignoring that first order contact rate of like having kin at all. And because kin comprise such a large proportion of it, I mean, I think people are underappreciating that. So I'm going to try and use this data to look at the first order effects on levels of contact and visitation and stuff like that.
So this is International Social Survey or something like that?
International Social Survey. And there's 1987, I think, there's 11 countries or 4 or not, 11 or 9, I can't remember. And then 2001, there's 27 countries. And then I'm pretty sure this year, like they're fielding, based on the timing, I think they're going to be fielding the social networks module again. So I might have 3 time points for at least several of the countries, which could be a kind of cool project. Can I tell about the Ebola thing? Does anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to touch on that because when you do this network graph, it was like this question you had here, like your assumption of what kinship is. There's a hard line with the nuclear family, but there's going to be all sorts of close genetic relatives that you're in contact with. So I mean, that's what I agree with. It's like that we can switch to the graph by the way. It's like that graph had all these assumptions that these families are linked with one link, but I'm sure they're linked with lots of other links, you know, cousin marriage in these places and stuff like that. You know, there's lots going on.
Exactly. So this is just showing those like what Harrison White calls like the primary kin ties, like the parent-children and marriage ties, right? But what I do here, this is the Ebola over time. Like this is every Ebola epidemic ever. Like the numbers of people that died from it. Clearly, very different scale in 2014, like a really big difference. So what I did is I took the kin networks for those countries that I simulated, and I assigned like an assumed contact rate. So people basically like they see their spouse every day, they see their parents every month, they see their cousins once a year, kind of stuff, and simulated like a Ebola outbreak on that. And I did it at different times, so 1975, 95, 2014, right? And these are the countries that have ever had Ebola. And one of the big takeaways is that that these numbers the tails of these distributions become, I should have zoomed in on this, but they become much larger over time, which I think is like reflective of the idea that there might be much larger outbreaks created by the increase in numbers of kin from the demographic transition, particularly numbers of siblings. And also that there's like countries like Sudan move way out in that direction too, and so there might be like a systemic risk of Ebola that we've kind of underestimated. But this is like totally nowhere near done. Like this is just like playing around with some stuff and seeing.
You've got to play around with like urbanization, sure, you know, as well, and increase like contact. So you've got one thing going down or up, and then
Another,
like at the same time. So you need almost a wider model or something like this.
Yeah. So I mean, this is why it's not done.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.